Mo. It is August 3rd, and yesterday on August 2nd I finished the first book that I read in August, so it is time for another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. This is where I talk about the books that I've read in the month. I talk for about 5 minutes and I tell you a little bit about the book and if I enjoyed it or not, and if I think you should read it or not as well. The first book that I finished in August was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This is the second book that I've read by Emily Henry, the first being Beach Read, which I read last summer. Book Lovers is definitely one of my anticipated reads for 2022. It came out in this year, and I was hoping that Book Lovers would give me some of the things that I liked in Beach Read, but more of them, the things that I didn't quite get enough of in Beach Read. And maybe it did. Book Lovers is about Nora Stevens, who is an author's agent and helps authors make the books that they love and the books that Nora loves, because Nora loves books. She was raised above a bookstore with her sister and her mother, and some of her best memories come from that time. Unfortunately, her mother passed away at a young age, and Nora had to take over care of her younger sister, had to become the adult, had to move back into the apartment over the bookstore, and hold everything together. So Nora has become a person who sometimes is wound too tightly. She makes plans, she makes lists, and she makes sure to check off all her lists and make sure that everything is perfect, keeping control over as much as she possibly can. Although Nora really likes her job and is extremely good at being an agent, she's always wanted to edit, and sometimes when she has to deal with editors, it's really hard for her. When she meets Charlie Lastra, a renowned editor, but renowned as much for his cranky demeanor and making his authors cry as for editing their books well, she and he get off on the wrong foot. And then they don't see each other for quite a long time, but they kind of become, like, in the back of their mind, rivals of the book world, the editing world. The book that Nora wanted Charlie to edit, he thinks is trash, but her sister loves, and when it finally comes out, becomes a bestseller. Her sister decides to take her to the town where this book takes place as a getaway, a sister's retreat, and a way for them to reconnect and spend time together. And then the book goes from there. Obviously, Charlie comes back into the picture. Obviously, Nora and Charlie have a little bit of an adversarial relationship at first, and then later, of course, they do not. They have a romantic relationship. What I liked about it was that it was not like many of the typical romances, whereas, yes, you could kind of call these enemies to lovers, but since they only met once and they met for such a brief time, they weren't really enemies. They just kind of symbolized something, or at least Charlie symbolized something in Nora's mind that was sort of an enemy vibe. But when they re-meet, they quickly become not only great friends, but, you know, lovers, or potential lovers. I liked that there wasn't so much like tropey enemies to lovers. Oh, I'm mad at you here, but I'm not mad at you here. Or oh, this or oh, that. There was a nice amount of like pining. There was a nice amount of like slow burn. I would definitely say this is a slow burn. This only has like one steamy scene in it. Or no, that's not true. It has more than one steamy scene, but it only has one like sex scene in it. And I find that a lot of the romances have at least 2 or 3 sex scenes in them, and anything else is considered slow burn, so I would say that this was slow burn. And it was nice and it was wholesome. There was never like a point where you thought that they were like lying to each other or cheating on each other or being disrespectful, and the kind of twist, miscommunication or non-communication was pretty easy to see and not insurmountable in a lot of ways. So you kind of were like, well, their struggle is because of the two people that they are and how much they respect each other and themselves, instead of their struggle being like, oh, I'm actually married, or like something, whatever. Not to give spoilers, but this is a very like simple, plain book, and I did really enjoy it. I don't know if I enjoyed it more than Beach Read. I personally really liked Beach Read. I know that's sometimes not everybody's favorite. I liked that Book Lovers had more of a glimpse into the publishing world and more about the process of being both an agent and a editor. I like that it had a little bit more to do with authors. I would like to see that theme like pushed so much further. I also read 7 Days in June this year, and that also has to do with the book world, the writing world. But again, like I wish the like book aspect of it, the writing aspect of it was like pushed further. I would like to see a romance like that, because I do think it's ripe for romance, because I think authors are readers, and romance is such a traditional writing trope that it's such a fun concept to have writers falling in love and being in a romance. Overall, I really enjoyed Book Lovers. I would highly recommend it. I read this one on audio, and Julia Whalen read it. She was the same person who read Beach Read, and I like her reading. I think she does a good job of the sexy parts and also like getting the different characters their own voice and their own structure to their narrative. And that was the first book that I read in August. It is August 5th, and yesterday I finished one more book in August. I finished Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. This is a poetry book, a well-known and beloved poetry book written when Rupi was 21 years old. I found this in a little free library a few days ago. Since I'm working on a reading for 24 hours vlog, this was a good short book that I could finish. I was also interested to see what all the hype was about because I had a feeling that this book was not for me, and it's not for me. I did mark some of the poems, but I'm not going to annotate this one the way I like to annotate my poetry books. This book is Rupi's exploration and rumination on her past, her abuses that she had to endure, sexual assault and parental assault, negligent parents, absent parents, sexual assault by family members, things like that. It's kind of broken up into 4 sections, so that's the first section. The next section is finding love and having boyfriends and kind of coming to the idea that she can be loved. The third section is about breakup, breaking up with those people, losing love, and then the last section is kind of about finding herself. Although she has lost love, she comes to realize that she is lovable and that no one is going to give her self-worth but herself. So definitely a 21-year-old's version of all those events. There's something very universal about it. There's something that everyone can relate to. There are poems that make perfect sense, but also it's a little obvious. It's a little like, yeah, I know, I learned that a long time ago, which maybe it's not for everyone, and certainly young people coming to this collection might not realize that, so this might be helpful to them, but I'm definitely not the target audience. I'm far too old for this one. I did like some of the poems. Most of the poems are written in like extremely short, tiny stanzas, and they are almost like mantras or daily affirmations or just affirmations in general that you could repeat to yourself over and over again. I liked that the breakup section was quite hopeful, and although it was obviously a devastating breakup for her at the time, there's never a moment in this where you think that she blames herself or hates herself. It's more about her coping with the reality of breakups and this specific breakup. At the end, there was some self-love stuff going on. This book is also illustrated with like very rudimentary gesture line illustrations. I do love this cover. I think it's really pretty. I like the negative space. I like the white on black. I don't think the illustrations added much in many aspects because I think they made a very obvious poem even more obvious. There's not a lot of subtext in these poems already. It's mostly just stating what she thinks or feels or what has happened. So then also having a picture about it just made it even more like obvious, kind of hitting you over the head. Again, I think this would be a great poetry collection for young adults, for older teenagers, for people who are starting out on their poetry journey and want something very relatable, very obvious that they can see clearly and not have to decipher the poems in this. And it's, again, a cute little addition. So glad to have read it. We'll be passing it on. That's all. And that was the second book that I read in August. It is August 7th, and I have finished 2 more books in August. I finished Dark Victory by Jeff Lobe and Tim Sale. This is a Batman bind-up of 12 issues that follow the events of The Long Halloween. So The Long Halloween is a Batman comic written by Jeff Lobe and illustrated by Tim Sale, and it was, I think, put out in 1995, which is when I first read it. And that follows Batman and Harvey Dent and Policeman Gordon. Maybe he's a police chief, but he's not the commissioner. He's not Commissioner Gordon by that point. How they all know each other and their adventures as they follow a killer who has been killing mobsters and mob-related people on holidays, starting with The Long Halloween. Dark Victory is the sequel to that. It was written not too much later, I don't think. Binded in 2001, so it looks like 1999 to 2000. So a little bit later than The Long Halloween. And this follows the events of The Long Halloween. There's a little bit of time that goes by between this one and that one, and we're revisiting the Calendar Man / holiday cases. We are following Janice Porter, who is the district attorney currently in Gotham, and she is kind of convinced that the person that was convicted of those crimes is not necessarily responsible for his actions, not necessarily innocent, but not necessarily responsible for his actions. So she is trying to kind of reinvestigate the case. And as that's happening, murders start occurring again on holidays. They follow a different MO this time, and they are killing different people, but Batman, of course, is concerned and looking into it. Commissioner Gordon and Batman have worked together for a long time now, and they know each other fairly well, but on this case they're divided. Commissioner Gordon thinks that it's a good idea to discuss their feelings and emotions over the tragedy that happened to Harvey Dent, and Batman does not think that. This is definitely exploring like the men's friendship and what happens when that friendship is betrayed and how men deal with those emotions. I liked this book. This is a reread for me. I've read this many times. The Long Halloween is one of my all-time favorite graphic novels. I think it's amazing. I like Batman novels in general. I love Tim Sale's artwork. I just think it's really stunning. There's a lot of use of very large panels. I love the way that he specifically draws Selena Kyle, Catwoman, who makes an appearance in this and plays a role in the first book as well. I read Dark Victory because as I was working on my library, I saw that I had another Long Halloween related graphic novel that I couldn't remember reading, and that is Batman Haunted Night. Now, as I read Dark Victory, I was looking through this and I realized that I haven't read this one yet because it's not all Tim Sale's artwork, so that just doesn't interest me as much. But I was super happy to have reread Dark Victory. I know the events of Long Halloween very well, and I probably reread it like once a year. I think I read it last year. But I haven't reread Dark Victory in a while, so I knew who did it and I knew the spoilers that were going to happen, but I couldn't remember how we got there. I will always suggest The Long Halloween as a Batman graphic novel to pick up. I do think that Tim Sale's artwork is a little bit tricky if you're not used to reading comics, because there are times when the word bubbles and other things might be a little confusing to someone who's not used to kind of reading comic pages. If you are looking for a comic book to break into Batman graphic novels, I will always, always, always suggest Batman Year One. I think that is a great, simple first graphic novel for people to start with, and it's Batman's origin story to a certain extent, so it's a great place to go. I would suggest Dark Victory only after reading The Long Halloween. The fourth book that I read in August is Two Old Women, an Alaskan legend of betrayal, courage, and survival by Velma Wallis. I picked this up last month at the Ocean Grove Ladies Auxiliary book sale, and I really didn't know what it was about. I didn't know if Velma Wallis was an Indigenous person, but it's like very short It has illustrations. It's very cute and little. I wanted to pick it up to just explore more, and I'm glad that I did. Velma Wallis is a Alaskan Indigenous person, and she has written several books. According to this book, which was written in 1993, she still lives in Alaska with her family, and she still writes books. I would definitely like to look her up and find out what else she wrote. This book is based on a traditional Alaskan legend slash story slash oral history, probably, about a nomadic tribe that is wandering around in a very harsh winter trying to find food and sustenance for their group, and they decide to leave the two oldest women behind as they continue on in their journey. The idea behind this being that these old women are just dragging them down. These old women are fairly cantankerous, and although they know each other, they're not super good friends until the events of this book. There's also a lot of talk in the tribe about possible cannibalism and rumors of that happening previously, and how if they end up taking the women with them, they might end up eating them. So there's a lot kind of psychologically going on. There's reasons, practical reasons and psychological reasons, that they might leave these women behind. They leave them behind, and this is the story of these two old women. One of them is 70 and one of them is 85, and it's their story of remembering back to their youth and finding out how to survive in this new predicament that they have found themselves in. This book also has a lot to do with the idea of sticking up for other people, the idea of standing up for what you think is right and going against the majority rule mentality so that you can do the right thing. It also has to do with Alaskan landscape and indigenous history of how the indigenous people were nomadic and hunted, fished, and caught food, made shelters, made clothing, and other things. It's all framed in a very fairy tale, oral history, legend kind of way, so it's told in a very simple style, but within the story there are, lots of actual historic ideas. So I think it's a good introduction both to Alaskan Indigenous culture and history, but also to indigenous practices that were practiced in Alaska and other places as well. Athabascan is the tribe that Wallis is part of, and this book was written in English, but it does have a little note in the back about a little bit of the history of the Athabascan people and their language. So I really like this one. I think this is a really good introduction to an indigenous story. I did think that it was a little meandering, a little long. It is 140 pages, and it could have definitely been condensed and told in a much more succinct manner, but I think that did have a lot to do with the oral practice that is traditional among many Native Americans and Native Canadians. So although I think as a book it could have been tighter, I think as a storytelling technique it worked perfectly well. And that was the fourth book that I read in August, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 24th, and I have finished 5 more books in August. 4 of those were audiobooks. I've definitely fallen far behind in updating my monthly reading wrap-up, so I'm going to try to rectify that now by telling you about the 5 books that I've read since I last spoke to you. The 5th book that I've finished in August was Little Eyes by Samanta Schweblin. This book is one that I first saw on Spoopy Hall's channel and became really interested in. Samanta Schweblin is known most for, I believe, Fever Dream, which is a novella, and Little Eyes is a short novel. It is following multiple different perspectives, people from all over the world, people from all different walks of life, but the thing that they all have in common is that they have purchased a Kantuki. A Kantuki is similar to like a Furby. It is a little creature stuffed animal that has electronics inside and can waddle around, wheel around your living room, you either buy a Kentucky as a Kentucky owner or as a viewer. They're all different kinds of creatures, but they all have cameras for eyes, and if you own a Kentucky, you buy the little creature and it lives in your house just like a pet. If you are a Kentucky viewer, you buy and upload to a Kentucky in someone's house. You can't decide who you are uploaded to, you can't decide who purchases your Kentucky, and you can't decide who views you from inside your Kentucky. These little creatures live in your house like pets. They roll around. Sometimes some owners learn to communicate with them, but they don't speak. They do make little noises and squeaks and things like that. You can't talk to the person inside your Kentucky. If you come up with a form of communication, you might be able to figure out a way to communicate with them, but some people just want their Kentuckys as pets, and some people just want the voyeuristic pleasure of watching someone else's world for a little while. This novel follows multiple different people, multiple different Kentuckys on both sides, viewers and owners, and some of the storylines connect and some of them do not. Some of them you see to their finalization and some of them kind of stop in the middle. It's a very interesting look at and commentary on social media and the idea of having someone view your life without knowing you. It's an interesting idea of voyeurism and how we like to look at other people's lives, how we want to participate in their lives while being an anonymous force. Sometimes we are a force for good and sometimes we're a force for bad. And the same goes with putting your life out on social media. It can be with great results and pure intention, or it can be with negative results and negative intentions. This is definitely a disturbing, creepy book. There's a lot of trigger warnings for sexual assault and violence, abuse, animal violence, because although these Kentuckys technically are not alive, there is a lot of mention of people abusing the little stuffed animals themselves, and it does get quite upsetting and disturbing. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was such an interesting idea. It has a lot of commentary on like what your responsibility to other people, to strangers is, and what your responsibility to when you see something going wrong, someone doing wrong in the world, what you should do about that. There was a lot of commentary on relationships and how people can be in the same room, can be in loving relationships but not know each other, and how sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers or turn to strangers than it is to connect with the people right in front of you. Really liked this. I thought the writing style was really interesting. I did listen to this on audio and I did enjoy the audiobook. This book was translated by Megan McDowell and I did read this for Women in Translation Month. Highly recommend that one. The next book that I read in August is The Cat Who Could Read Backwards by Lillian Jackson Braun. I read this for an upcoming Cat Cozy Mystery vlog, and I also read it over Cat Lady Weekend to be able to participate in that readathon. Leanne Reads started that readathon, and I will link her channel down below. I've read The Cat Who Could Read Backwards and many of the other Cat Who mystery books when I was a teenager, and I really loved them. I think there's like 29 or something. So this is the first one, and I hadn't read it probably in 20 years at least. So I didn't know what to expect. I also didn't realize that this book was written in 1966. This is the first of the Cat Who mystery series, and it follows Quillerin, who is aging and down on his luck, down in his station in life, reporter. He had been a famous reporter, he had had a wife, he had had a life, and now he's forced to take a job at a low-level magazine newspaper in Chicago as an art reporter. He's not an art critic, they already have an art critic. He's just a person who is going to do puff pieces on art galleries and artists in the area. He has to take this job though because it's kind of his last chance, and he finds himself quite intrigued with the art critic because as soon as he starts getting to know the art scene, he sees that the art critic for this newspaper is truly, truly abhorred and hated. And he wants to know why. So not only does he end up meeting this art critic, getting embroiled and involved in the Chicago art scene, but he also ends up living in the art critic's downstairs apartment. Of course, this is a cozy mystery, so there is a murder, there's theft, and a bunch of other things that Quillerin ends up getting involved in, but the strangest part of his new life is meeting Coco, the art critic's cat, who can read backwards. I had no idea what to expect going back into this book. I remember loving these books, breezing through them. They're quite short, they're all in the under 300 page count range. I was hoping that they would be good as I remembered, but I wasn't holding my breath for that. Turns out they're just as good as I remembered, maybe better, especially having read so much more now, so much more cozy mysteries, especially having read so many more modern books. It's kind of shocking how well these books hold up. There are a few problematic or troubling language uses, word uses, slang, and slurs, but not as much as I would have thought, and this is definitely a fun little romp of a mystery, and I'm super excited to see what happens in the next book. I think I own the next book physically because I think I got rid of all my physical copies except for one, which was The Cat Who Ate Danish Modern, which is book 2 in the series. So I definitely plan on continuing the Cat Who series, and I definitely highly recommend this for those who like cat mysteries, cozy mysteries, and mysteries written between 1950 and 1990. The next book that I read in August was Ellen Foster by Kaye Gibbons. This is a extremely short Southern Gothic novel. It is in the Southern Gothic oeuvre, I guess, and I have been wanting to read more of that because I really don't know much about that writing style. This is compared to, on the cover, Holden Caulfield. It follows Ellen, who is a young girl struggling with her abusive and neglectful father, with her mentally ill mother, with her wish and hope for belonging, but her continual and constant displacement through poverty and neglect and prejudice. It follows Ellen as she sees her family disintegrate and she looks for a place where she can be herself. She's an extremely outspoken and unlikable main character, partly just because she's like a child. She's like 10 or 12 throughout this book, and her narration is very childish. There's a lot of things that you understand as an adult reader that she doesn't understand yet, but she's also a child who thinks she knows a lot about the world and has a lot of worldly experience because of all the horrible things that she's gone through, but she's still just a child. I think this book is probably also hard and or off-putting because there's no quotation marks in this book. There's no speech marks. It means that everything that you read is kind of filtered through Ellen's head. Even if there's dialogue in the book, it's really her remembering the dialogue. And this one did take me a long time to read. Even though it is a short novella, it's only 126 pages. It took me a long time to get through, partly because of the subject matter and partly because of the writing style. I didn't particularly love Ellen's voice, but I did enjoy the way it was written, and I did want to see her story to completion. This book does jump forward and backward in time, so you kind of do know the end result of Ellen's story throughout the book, but you're finding out how she got there and what's going to happen to her past the end of this book. I'm glad that I read it. I wouldn't consider it very much of like a modern Gothic, Southern Gothic classic necessarily. I've never heard of this book before. I have also recently picked up another Kaye Gibbons book. She was a Southern writer, writing mostly in the 80s. So I'd be interested to see just like what another book by her is like, and if the writing style is very different or follows kind of the same ideas and themes, etc. This was the 7th book that I read in August. The 8th book that I read in August was Penance by Kanae Minato, translated by Philip Gabriel. This is a Japanese translated work, and Minato is most recently famous and known for Confessions, although Penance and Confessions were both written quite a few years ago, but more recently translated into English. Penance follows a group of young Japanese girls living in a small town who one day on a school holiday and on a traditional holiday have to kind of find something for themselves to do. They're not allowed to go to the river, they're not allowed to go to each other's houses, so they end up going to the schoolyard even though the school is closed and playing there. But their play is interrupted when a workman comes and takes one of the girls away. The girls go on playing without their friend until they realize that it's been quite a long time. The bell to come back home has rung and they can't find their friend. They go to look for her and find her murdered. This story is broken up into different perspectives of each of the girls as they tell their story of the murder, of what they wish they had done, what they thought they could have done better, and what their lives were like after the murder. Of course, having their friend murdered when they were young irreparably damages the rest of their lives, changes the course of their lives, and this is a story all about how those changes affected them, how the damages and trauma that they suffered as young children follows them through life. And it's also a lot about how you can internalize trauma and internalize grief and guilt, and how you can be seen as grief-stricken and guilty by others, and how others' opinion of your grief and guilt affect you as well. I liked this book. I thought it was interesting to see the story from multiple perspectives and to have some repeated information of the girls' trauma and the experience of the day of the murder, and also to see how, even though they went their separate ways later in life, they were still somehow connected both to the murder and to each other. It was almost like a book of interconnected short stories, and I believe Confessions is the same way, because although some pieces of information are restated, the perspective never comes back later. So you get one person's perspective, the whole story, and that's it. And then you get another person's perspective, their whole story, and that's it. And then another. You do find out about the other people in the other stories, but you never like read from them again. I had no intention or desire to read Confessions. I know that Books and Lala really liked that one. I know a lot of horror and thriller readers really like that one, but it just didn't interest me that much. But when I saw Penance free on audio, I thought I would give it a try, and I think that they're going to end up being quite similar. So I definitely would give Confessions a try. I enjoyed Penance, and it was a fairly quick and easy read. I'm not sure if it was one narrator or multiple narrators, but either way, I thought the stories were distinct enough that you were easily able to tell the difference between all the characters, and each girl had similar themes in their stories and very different themes in their stories. This definitely does deal with difficult topics and themes as well, SA, murder, and also a lot of death and abuse that follows these girls through their lives. It also has to do with like not knowing someone or believing that someone is good or evil and then the tables kind of being turned on you, which I think is an interesting theme. So I would recommend that one. I was happy to have read this one for Women in Translation Month. The last book that I have to update you on is Come Closer by Sarah Gran. This is a short horror novel that was written quite a few years ago, I think in the early 2000s, but has been getting a lot of buzz recently. I know Books and Lala recently read this and really enjoyed it, and Criminale recently read it and enjoyed it. I thought this was a newer book by Sarah Gran, but it's actually an older book that was written before her mystery series. I've read all 3 of her mystery series books and really enjoyed them, and I also read Return to Saturn, which was her debut novel, and really enjoyed that. So it is no surprise that I really enjoyed Come Closer as well. This is a demonic possession horror book, and there's definitely blood and gore and horror, murder, disturbing dreams, animal abuse, sexual assault, and many other scary themes and ideas, insanity, and many other things. But I really like this one. It was very short and to the point. It was very plainly written, but that made it even more creepy. This book follows Amanda and her husband. They live in a loft in a semi-remote area in the city. It was a cheap loft, but they wanted the space, and they ended up being quite happy with the neighborhood, even though it's a little sketchy. One thing that does bother Amanda is that she hears tapping and weird footstep type noises a lot in the house, but she figures that it's an old apartment building that's been renovated, so it's probably just that. Her husband hears them as well, but only when Amanda's in the house. Weird things start happening to Amanda, and one of the things that she ends up finding is a book on the theory of being possessed by a demon. She's been having weird dreams, she's been hearing voices, she's been acting a little bit out of character, she's started smoking again, and in this book, those are noted as some of the possible consequences of being possessed. At first, she doesn't really take this seriously, and she doesn't really take the book seriously, but as things progress and she checks more and more things off the demonic possession list, she has to acknowledge and understand that she might be possessed by a demon. So this is Amanda's story about how she comes to these realizations, what she does about them, who the potential demon is, and why they're possessing her, and what they're making Amanda do. Again, I really like that this was kind of a straightforward story, and it was done in a very not supernatural way, in a very day-to-day life way, and it made you feel a little bit nervous. You know, you wanted to take that quiz yourself and see if you maybe were possessed by a demon. This definitely has a lot of violence, a lot of gore in it, but luckily some of the things that I was hoping they wouldn't go to that direction, they didn't. So even though there was some animal violence and other violence, it wasn't as bad as I thought, but it did give you a very good creepy, unsettling feeling. It also made you wonder if other people were possessed. My camera battery died, but I am back. One thing I did want to mention is that there is a little bit of homophobia in this book, and I'm not sure if that is a choice or if that is kind of the writer coming through. I don't remember the other Sarah Gran books that I read being homophobic or any characters really being homophobic, but it's been so long since I read them. The last one I read was in 2020, and before that it was probably 10 or 12 years earlier, so there definitely was a little bit of homophobic language and sentiment in this book, and that definitely did give me pause for thought. But it's very much like a kind of aside, not really the main plot or anything. So maybe it is just a weird character development that our main character is a little anti-queer. I'm not sure. I don't think it's enough that it would make me not read this book again or not recommend this book, but it is enough that when I read more Sarah Gran, I will keep my eye out for that. And those were the 9 books that I've read so far in August, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 31st, and I have finished 2 more books in August. Now, I would normally wait to update you on these until I've read the last book that I'm going to read in August. I think I am going to finish one more book today, but also I wanted to talk about these two next books. The 10th book that I finished in August was Please Look After Mom by Kyung-Suk Shin. This is a contemporary Korean novel about a family who, as their parents are coming to visit, the family who lives in Seoul, the big city in South Korea, the father loses sight of the mother and the mother goes missing. This story is told from multiple different perspectives of some of the children, of the father, and of other people as they are looking for their mom and hoping that someone will please look after mom. One of the major themes of this book is that the children are recollecting and thinking back to their mother and whether she was well or not, whether she was ill, whether they could have helped her more. And I think a very common theme that I've noticed in Korean writing is the idea that you don't really know anyone, that your life is kept separate from the people around you, even your family, even the people that you love, even the people that you think you're closest to. The theme of being troubled by that idea, by not really knowing people, by not really understanding them, by other people not understanding you, is very prevalent in this book. This book is told in a really interesting way because the majority of the time it uses the second person, so it's like you are looking for your mother, you remember when this happened, you did this thing, you did that thing. Because it's told from different perspectives, that does change sometimes. The first perspective is told from the youngest daughter, who is an author. The second perspective is told from the oldest son. The third perspective is told from the husband/father. And the last several perspectives change. And you also get insight from other people as well. So you get letters from other of the children or interactions with other of the children looking for their mother, trying to find her, but also trying to understand who she was as a person, whether she was ever found or not, whether she was ever someone that they knew or could recognize or understand. And therefore, if they couldn't even understand their mother, how can the world understand them? I really like this book. It definitely is a little bit on the longer side. It's not that long. It's only 250 pages. The pages are like really thick pages, so it looks like a much longer book. It looks like a 300-page book, but it's like only 250. This book was translated from the Korean by Chi-Young Kim. I did read this for Women in Translation Month, and I was excited to get to it. It was a little bit more difficult to get into and stay into. Possibly that's because it's a translated work, and possibly that's just because of the subject matter. I'm not very much into like intergenerational family dramas, multi-generational family dramas, so this is definitely, you know, about the past and how husband and wife meet. They touch on their childhoods, they touch on the children's childhoods, they touch on later events in this family life, and that's just not really the kind of book that I'm interested in or that I generally enjoy. But I did appreciate this book, and I personally really like second person, so I really liked reading from the second person perspective. I've never read from second person perspective in different people in the same book. So you're reading from multiple people in the you tense. You did this, but sometimes you are the mother's daughter, sometimes you are the mother's husband. So it's interesting to always feel like the book is talking about you and that you are interactive and interacting with the book, but you are different people when you're doing it. I thought that was like a really interesting aspect of this book. I know a lot of people struggle with that perspective just from one person, so having it from multiple people might be hard to read or confusing. I did like that the sections were broken up into like quite large chapters. There's, you know, 5 or 6, but like most of them are quite chunky. So you're with that person, you're with the youngest daughter for a good amount of time. And as you're meeting the youngest daughter, the oldest son, the husband, you're seeing events that they all knew about from different eyes. But it doesn't feel very repetitive. There is some repetitive nature to this book, and I do find that to be true of many of the Korean translated works that I found, but I think that's more of a storytelling / historical technique than like a book technique. But I don't think that the sections of the different people's perspectives were that repetitive. I found them to be quite distinct styles and voices, even though they were in the same perspective, the second person perspective. I do think it's interesting that almost all of the Korean books, many of the Korean books that I've read anyway, have that theme of not really knowing the people around you, being a family but not being close, loving your family but not being close to them, not understanding them. And in the horror books that I've read, it's very much a theme of like, no one understands me and I can't understand anyone else. And in the contemporary books that I've read, it's still a little bit horrifying. It's still a little bit scary, that idea that even the people that raised you or that you raised, you don't understand and you cannot connect with, even though they're the only people that are available to connect with. I thought it was really interesting to see this family and how they reacted different and how they all felt guilt and responsibility for letting their mom get lost and disappear, to try to think about what you would do in that situation, whether you were the person who were lost or the person who was looking for the people who were lost. The next book that I read in August was also for Women in Translation Month. This was Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri Yu. This is a Japanese translated work, and I don't have my phone, so I don't know the translator, but I will put the translator down here. It's a little bit of a historical fiction. It takes place a little bit in the past. I want to say like 80s, maybe the 90s. And it's all about one man reflecting on his life. He is homeless and he's reflecting on his past, his history, his childhood, how he started working from a young age, how he always went from job to job, first taking care of his parental family and his siblings, and then later taking care of his wife and child and children. It's an interesting book because it's very stream of consciousness. I read this book on audio, and I think that it was a little bit confusing on audio because the stream of consciousness style of writing and hearing about this man's life from childhood to his own children being born, and then to the untimely death of his son and wife, was a little bit hard to grasp where we were in time, because the stream of consciousness style of writing made it so that sometimes you were in the present and he was in the homeless encampments in Tokyo Ueno Station, or sometimes he was in the past, or sometimes he was in the near past, or sometimes he was in the far past. Sometimes he was thinking about himself as not being a person anymore and not being able to connect with the world, and kind of being the spirit who is thinking back over his life. But sometimes that was clear that he was doing that, and sometimes it was like he was living those moments in that time, which kind of makes sense for the whole idea of like spirits and reflecting on your life as you are dead or dying. It's definitely a very sad story. He has a lot of death in his life, and, you know, trigger warnings for death of a child and for death of a spouse, animal death and animal abuse, homelessness and homeless abuse, government abuse of homeless people, and lots of other things. This was a really quick read, and it was quite short. I think it was only like 4 hours, so it's definitely worth picking up if any of this sounds interesting to you. I wasn't sure if I was really going to get into it at first, but then I ended up really enjoying it. The stream of consciousness style of writing means that you're also just maybe hearing a snippet of conversation between two people who are near the homeless encampment, or maybe you're talking about a conversation that he overheard years ago. But no matter what, you're kind of this nebulous floating idea of life and how life is lived and the different milestones and tragedies that a person faces in life. Certainly a great one for Women in Translation Month. Those were the next two books that I read in August, and if I read one more book, I will be back to talk about that, but if I don't, I will be back with my wrap-up of the wrap-up. It is September. It's a little bit into September, but I read one more book in August. I thought I was going to finish this on the 31st of August, and I did. This is The True Deceiver by Tove Jansson, translated by Thomas Teal. This was such an interesting book. This follows Katri, who lives in a remote Swedish town where winter is most of the year and it's very hard to live there, it's hard to get around, it's hard to survive. And Katri has survived taking care of her brother Mats by initially working in the store that they live above, and then later by being a bookkeeper for the store, and then later by being kind of a bookkeeper around town and an advice giver. So she is able to kind of make a living and keep her brother safe by utilizing her skills both in math and numbers, but also in telling the truth and following her own set of morals, mores, and rules for how to be fair with everyone that comes to her with work for her or advice from her. Mats works in a boat making workshop and he really loves boats. He really wants a boat. He really wants to make boats, but he is also a very odd character, and between him and Katri, the town don't really trust either of them. They're outcasts, both because they look different. They have dark hair where everyone has light, and they act different because they tell the truth, even though sometimes it's not very nice. Katri's motives to take care of her brother lead her to come up with creative ways that they can live in a better house, that they can have a better life, that they can make more money, that Mats can have his boat and live out his dreams. Katri sees an opportunity with a reclusive artist who lives in town. This reclusive artist has lived there her whole life, but when her parents died, she became even more introverted, staying in her house and really never leaving except to explore the forest during the spring and summer to create her artwork. So this story is all about Katri ingratiating herself and ingraining herself into this artist's life. Although Katri knows that she's doing this for her own motivations, and although she knows she's doing this in a slightly nefarious or dishonest way, she has all these rules about how she is being truthful, being fair, and playing fair to get what she wants out of this relationship with the artist. This book, like while I was reading this book, I was like, oh, this is the best book that I've read all year. This is the best book. I think writing-wise, it is astonishing and amazing, and I see why everyone loves Tove Johnson, and I understand why she is considered such a brilliant author and writer, and I definitely can't wait to read more of her writing. While I was reading this, I was totally immersed in the story. There was so much going on subtextually throughout this story, and people's motivations, and the idea of honesty, and the idea of fairness and truthfulness. But like, I think a lot of it went over my head. I think this book was like too smart for me. It's a very simple book, but it's very big brained. And while I was reading it, it was just so absolutely captivating. But when I wasn't reading it, it's not as impactful as I thought it would be. When I would put this book down for a little while, it wasn't, like I didn't have that magical lingering feeling as I might have with some books that I love. But when I picked it up again, you were totally mystified by this environment and this author and the themes that were happening. There's a little bit of animal violence in this. There's definitely deception. There's definitely lying. There's the potential for romance, but I think overall this book is about how people isolate themselves or try not to isolate themselves. I think it's about societal norms. I think it's about finding your place in society and how you can keep that place. I think it's about societal mores and what fits into those things and what doesn't. And then also, of course, it is about truthfulness, deception, reliance on others, respect for others, and how certain rules and procedures are in place so that society doesn't fall apart, or so that we have a place in society. It's a fascinating book. It's a beautiful book. The descriptions of the cold landscape, the depiction of relationships and relationships between people, relationships between objects, relationships between environments, relationships between animals is all interwoven in this really gorgeously evocative writing, but also very simple, very plain, very easy to understand. Although it is told as you are watching Katri and her decisions, we do get some insights and some flashbacks into her mental state and what she's actually thinking, as opposed to like more of an omnipotent narrator that is happening throughout the majority of this book. There's no break. There's no italics to dictate when we're in Katri's mind. You just start reading from her mental interior perspective, and that was very interesting. So overall, I would definitely highly suggest reading this book. It was a great one to read for Women in Translation Month, and I can't wait to read more of her writing. This is all set in winter and only the very glimpse of spring at the end, but she has a book called The Summer Book, so I really want to read that one and see how it compares. This also is a book about kind of art and creative process, and also how labor can be creative and about how math can be creative. It's about sticking up for yourself. It's about sticking up for your family. It's about using any means necessary to make your family safe. There's a lot going on in this one. And that was the 12th book that I read in August. So I read a lot of books for Women in Translation, which is great. I would also consider Two Old Women a book in translation, although it technically was just written in English. I think it is loosely a translation of a Alaskan indigenous myth. What is translation? How are we translating things? Is it just one person translating from one language to another, or is it oral history translated into written history? I read some poetry. I read a Southern Gothic novella. I read a graphic novel. So I read a lot of different things. I definitely mostly focused on female authors, and I definitely mostly focused on women in translation, which was really great. I will be doing, I swear, a quarterly readathon wrap-up. I missed my Q2 wrap-up, and it's almost the end of Q3, so I will be doing those at some point. The highlights of the month were definitely, I think, The True Deceiver. I would say that Little Eyes was a big highlight, and looking back on it, I think Penance was a big highlight for me too. I read quite a few books by authors of color, but not as many as I would have liked. I read a couple of books with queer themes, but not as many as I would have liked. But overall, it was a fantastic reading month, and I am super happy to have participated in Women in Translation. I was also able to participate in the Cat Lady Readathon, although I only got to read one book for that. And I have a lot of videos that I made in August that will be coming out later. I've definitely gotten behind in my video editing, not necessarily filming, because I have been filming a lot of videos, so there are a lot of videos that are going to be coming out soon. I also have a life update probably coming soon because some things in my life are changing, but hopefully that will mean that my videos will be more consistent. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here, and let me know what you thought of them. Let me know, out of all the reviews that I did here, what sounded most interesting to you and what you're most excited to get to, or what you put on your want to read list. And I will catch you in the next one. So thanks so much for joining me. Bye.